We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 165 for June 5th, 2019. I'm your host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we talk about preservation versus conservation and cities of the future. So get out your drafting table and pencils because we're creating the future and because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now. All right, welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today is Stephen in Calgary.
Hello.
Hey, so it's Memorial Day weekend, a Sunday morning at our normal recording time, and you know, as can be predicted, I think everybody's out doing stuff. So, and I will be soon. Actually, we're shifting our Memorial Day weekend just a couple days because my brother-in-law's coming in 2 hours, and he's going to be here till Wednesday. So we're just kind of shifting our weekend, and we're going to have some time with him out here. So that's why I'm able to make this, but. Anyway, how you doing, Stephen?
And I'm in Canada, so like we already had our 3-day weekend,
right?
And everybody in Canada is like sitting around all pissed off because they don't get Memorial Day off, despite the fact that we already just had a 3-day weekend.
Right.
It's Victoria Day, so where where Canadians celebrate, I guess, their Victorian values and by going out and drinking a lot in parks.
Okay,
but,
then
yeah.
Sounds good. So does Canada have like a Memorial Day type of thing?
Yeah, it's Victoria Day. It's
that's the same.
It's the third Monday, not the last Monday of May.
I don't mean like a 3-day weekend in May. I mean a weekend or a day where they honor fallen veterans.
Oh, well, that's Remembrance Day.
Oh, Remembrance Day. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, remember that one? Yeah.
No, I don't actually. I have no idea.
Remembrance Day, the U.S. used to celebrate it. It's Veterans Day now.
Oh, right.
Yeah, well, no, and the original meaning was the people who died in World War One, right?
Right.
It's to memorialize that, and lest we forget, like remember how bad war is,
right?
And that was the original point, and then it got expanded to include all veterans, not just the fallen.
Sure.
In the U.S. And then they, but then they're like, but we need something to honor the fallen. So that's where Memorial Day comes in. And which is interesting because now it seems like a lot of the conversation for Memorial Day is like thanking veterans. And it's like, well,
yeah,
wait, it's kind of like mission creep, right? So
it is. We actually talk about this in Civil Air Patrol a lot because we have different events that we do for Memorial Day and for Veterans Day, and we like to educate the public and say, don't thank veterans for their service on Memorial Day. That's not what this day is for. It's a quiet day of reflection. If you want to do that or go camping, whatever you're going to do. But it's a quiet day of reflection to honor the people who have fallen in war or battle or as a result of their service to the country in some way or another. And then Veterans Day is not for that. Veterans Day is for honoring the people who are actually serving or have served in the military and, didn't die. That's what Veterans Day is for. Two different holidays, if that's the right word. The weird thing is you don't get like a 3-day weekend for Veterans Day, but you do for Memorial Day. That's if you're going to have a federal type holiday. I mean, it's not the same thing. It's not a day off for like a lot of things, but Memorial Day is.
It's still a federal holiday, though. So if you work in the federal setting, you do get the day off. Which is weird because half the time it's like a Wednesday, right? And it's like, wow, I just broke up the week pretty well. and then you get American Thanksgiving, which is on a Thursday.
Yeah.
And that blows Canadians' minds because it's like, but it's Thursday. And it's like, yeah, that's why Black Friday is a thing because nobody's going back to work for one day. So everybody like hangs out and recovers from all the turkey and goes shopping.
Yeah. I don't know what the original intent behind a Thursday was. Was it so we could have a 4-day weekend? Was that like the intent? I mean, I don't really know.
I think and I'm probably going to get this wrong. So, but it'll be recorded for posterity on this podcast. I think that originally the president had to announce when Thanksgiving was, like every year. And so like the date could move. It was kind of a floating holiday. And I want to say it's like Roosevelt or Teddy, the first one. Yeah, early in the 20th century, somehow it got solidified as being on a Thursday, which is just weird. But so November is really just kind of like useless because you end up with 2 federal holidays in the middle of weeks.
Well, I looked up the Wikipedia entry for Thanksgiving, and it's actually so complicated I can't just go right to the answer. There's a lot of stuff here. I can't just like skim it and find it. So fixing date, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff. So that's not what this podcast is about, however. And I do see October 31st, 1939, Roosevelt proclamation changing the holiday to the next to the last Thursday in November for business reasons. Business reasons. That's what it says. So anyway.
So like he had planned Black Friday all along.
I think he did. Yeah, totally. So. All right. Well, so this recording, what I want to discuss first is I do a radio show, an archaeology radio show. So if you're interested in hearing live archaeology discussion, whatever that means, whether I have guests or I've got a guy who's kind of becoming a regular co-host. He's a comedian here in town, but also a science enthusiast and a good friend of mine, fun person to talk to. His name's Brian Woods. And he came down this last Friday, and the studio's in Carson City, Nevada, and it's a really small community radio station. I don't get any money. Nobody does for doing any of that stuff. They subsist on donations like most community radio stations do. And it's an hour long. It's at noon Pacific time on Fridays. So if you want to tune in, knvc.org /listen-live will get you there. And I will leave that link in the show notes so you can go find that. But also, just as an aside on that, I'm always looking for guests for that show. So if you're doing something you can talk about and you want to bring it in and do some public archaeology and possibly even take some calls, occasionally we do get calls into that show because that's what I want it to be, as a call-in show. Then, let's do some public archaeology, or maybe you've got a deep knowledge of some region of the country or something like that, and you just want to talk about it. I'm not going to make you talk for a straight hour. I'm going to ask you questions. I'm an archaeologist, of course, so we'll just have a conversation about something, and it's nice and fun and super chill. If you want to hear back episodes of that, go over to arcpodnet.com/archaeology, because I take every recording from that radio show and I put it in the archaeology show feed for the archaeology show podcast. So that's cool too. Anyway, what I want to talk about is something that kind of came up after a discussion about ISIS, of all things. We were talking about an article where somebody went in and actually tried to value a small slice of a couple sites that were being heavily looted by ISIS, or at least had been heavily looted by ISIS. And then, ISIS profited from that, because people have been throwing numbers around saying, oh, ISIS is making billions of dollars off of selling looted artifacts. But they want to say, well, how much are we actually talking about here? Like, what does this look like? And they created these algorithms basically based on the types of artifacts that typically come from these sites, because they don't really know what was dug up and sold, obviously, but the types of artifacts that would come from these sites, and then looked on the antiquities market and, the legal antiquities market and said, okay, what has this stuff sold for in the past? And then what's like I think they called it the farm gate value, which is basically the first person, like whoever dug that up out of the ground and put it in their pocket and walked off the site. What did they sell it for? Because obviously they get a way lower price than the end price that's paid for that. So that's what we were talking about. But that really veered off the rails fast. And we were talking about, and Stephen, I know you're going to have a lot to say about this, but we were talking about cities of the future and preservation. And anytime, because in conjunction with that article, I also saw another article where it was architects' renderings of what cities should look like in 50 years. I think it was 40 or 50 years. And of course, you can predict just without even seeing the pictures what they mean by that. They're all green, there's vegetation everywhere, because that's kind of the way modern building design is going, is let's make this a whole community and let's make certain floors all, gardens, and we can take all our resources from this one place. We can recycle everything, bring it all in. Chances are people won't have to leave for most things. You can even work there, all these things happening in one spot. And they're doing this in a lot of newer towers over in Asia and even Dubai. And so that made me think, okay, so what does preservation look like? Because you think of every science fiction show you've ever seen, and again, I know it's fiction, but you think of every science fiction show you've ever seen based in the future, and you think of every artist's rendering of a future city you've ever seen, and every, what does this look like? What don't you see? You don't see old buildings. You just don't. So all this stuff that's on the National Register in this country is presumably torn down in 50 years, right? According to these artists' renderings, and we're not keeping anything. My question is that so bad? Is it so bad? Because we tend to move the goalposts on what history means, right? Like here in Reno, there's this whole movement by a very small group of people that are very vocal, though, for saving mid-century modern hotels. Now, let's just think about that for a second. Reno was founded in the 1860s, okay? And when Reno was founded in the 1860s, it was a dirty, dusty western town that had displaced the Paiute Indians that were living here originally on the Truckee River, put up a bunch of shacks, and then people started making tons of money off the Comstock lode, the silver up in Virginia City, and then gold at some point, other resources. They started putting up mansions. By the end of the 1800s, they started putting up buildings. Downtown Reno started to take form. And then the early part of the century, the 20th century, bigger buildings coming in, casinos, gambling. I mean, that was just a fact of Western life. But then when Nevada legalized gambling, it was, Reno became, of course, known for that. And this is well before Las Vegas. Las Vegas was a dusty watering hole up until the 50s. So, Las Vegas is a really new city in Nevada, but it's obviously enormous, probably because it's proximity to Los Angeles. But Reno has been around and like that in a seedy, dirty gambling town for a really long time. And now all these older hotels that are basically weekly or monthly rentals, to be honest, a lot of low income people live in there. There is a lot of crime associated with these things. There's a lot of drug deals that happen there. There's illegal prostitution. Prostitution's legal in the state of Nevada, but it's not legal within the city limits of Reno. So you have to go outside into the county, of course. And it's just they're tearing these down and putting up new buildings. And my question is, why are we saying that the character of Reno is the 1950s when Reno goes much farther back than that? The character of Reno is the Truckee Meadows with teepees on it. The character of Reno is megafauna. I mean, how far back do you go? So, Stephen, what are your thoughts on this? Where do we put the starting point for what the character of a city is? What defines a city? What should we preserve and why? And should we preserve anything in a physical sense rather than just a pure digital and experiential sense and preserve it in our stories and our memories? What do you think?
I'm not sure where to start on this topic.
It's all over the place.
Yeah. A lot of thoughts. Let's see if I can remember them all. Well, I'm gonna go back to to what you're talking about with these cities of the future and
yes,
and the unified look and feel of essentially art palettes, right? Like when you are designing something, when you are planning something, like visually, you tend to have a specific look and feel in mind. And I see this a lot on Instagram with some of the menswear enthusiasts. Like they particularly have a specific look and feel in mind as far as, their outfits go, but it really works with certain backdrops, certain settings. And it's really easy for people to be like, oh, this is going to be so awesome. I love this look. But then that's not where they're actually living or acting or doing stuff. Right. And so it's like, so if you want to be all like, 1920s Art Deco, but then, you're working at a mid-century hotel, it doesn't really, you kind of stick out because you're not fitting in with the rest of the scenery.
Right.
So for like the visions of the future, like architects and stuff like that, is they have a specific setting that they're working with, and it doesn't necessarily, fit because it's like we tend to think in terms of like specific palettes essentially. And I think one of my favorite examples of this is the TV show Poirot.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly when it was a TV show, but also when they started doing the longer 2-hour, like made for TV movies things.
Right.
The novels, the stories take place from like the 20s into the 40s and beyond. So there's a lot of stylistic changes that go on. But when they made the TV show, they made the conscious decision that, okay, we're setting it all in the 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And because, they had to dial it down. It couldn't be all over the place. Part of doing that means all the buildings, all the backdrops, all the settings were 1920s, like Art Deco style modern buildings.
Yeah.
There's nothing from like 1890. There's nothing from 1895. These buildings would still be there, right? Like, and it's the notion that I always joke, like, in Poirot, it's the 1920s, but everything is new. It's like they totally just wipe out the past, and part of that is to establish that mood.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you had the complexity of reality, which is like all these time periods, you don't really get the same feeling off the setting.
Mm-hmm.
And they've got 50 minutes to tell a story. And the setting's not the story. The setting sets the mood for this story. So we need to, dial that all in and hurry up. And I think that's where a lot of, these science fiction, views of the cities are going. It's like, that's not the story. That's the mood. That's the backdrop.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how we think. Like to move it forward to your, talking about your mid-century thing, is that people have specific ideas of what historical means. And we all have this snapshot. And the example I've used since undergrad, Plains Indians.
Yeah.
If you think of the Sioux, you have a very specific view, like picture in your mind, and it's not necessarily what they're doing today. Mm-hmm. It's probably what they were doing in the, 1870s, 1880s. Mm-hmm. There's a particular photograph in our heads, a picture in our heads of what's going on. Like that's completely wrong. Like they were doing different stuff before that. They're doing different stuff now. And that was a snapshot. And in a lot of cases, I've noticed that some Native groups really like that snapshot of what life was like at point of contact. Mm-hmm. And because that was when it was them, right? And not them being forced to be something else.
Right.
So to bring this all forward to your, preservation of mid-century hotels, I'm okay with that as long as that's not the only thing. Like I get it. Like and mid-century is huge. Like I some of you might know that I'm a cyclist, and I in the winter when the weather's bad, which is 9 months out of the year in Alberta, I ride on an indoor trainer, and there's a program called Zwift that I can connect to my trainer, and so like it's like a virtualized setting that adjusts the resistance on my on my trainer. But they just added a desert thing with like full it was totally like mid-century Jetsons sort of stuff.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Oh, and it's beautiful. It's fun.
Yeah.
So mid-century is a big thing, but like you were saying, it's not the only thing.
Yeah.
So I think that it's perfectly acceptable to be preserving stuff like that, especially under Criterion C, right? Like you want to talk style. Man, mid-century, man.
Well, I know. That's a good place to take a break, because Criterion C and all the National Register criteria are something I want to talk about, of course, in the context of this discussion, because that's what's keeping all this stuff around, to be honest. So let's pick that up on the other side of the break. Back in a second. Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% 20% off your first 3 months or go to zencastr.com and use the code CRMARC. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode. All right, we are back with episode 165 of the CRM Archaeology podcast, and we've been joined over the break by Doug. Doug, welcome to the show.
Hey, guys.
So let's pick it back up. And Stephen, when we ended the last segment, you brought up Criterion C, the National Register, the National Park Service's National Register criteria. And of course, Criterion C is for, the quick way to remember it is construction. Is it the work of a master? Is it something that was built by either somebody or is in a style that is unique or representative or one of the first representations of a certain style? And when we're talking about architecture, and we were talking about mid-century modern stuff, like particularly here in Reno for me, but it's all over the country. That early examples of that, I mean, they're very iconic of certain areas. But my question is, does Criterion C or any of the criteria of the National Register in reference to this, do we have to, and I know the answer to this already, but I just want to put it out there. Do we have to actually preserve these things in reality to be in the spirit of the criterion? Or can you, in the context of a building, let's take Notre Dame Cathedral, which we've talked about before. As everybody probably knows that's listening to this, it burned practically to the ground except for the stone outside in some cases. Some of that crumbled too, but a lot of it on the outside is still there, but most of the inside is gone. The roof is gone. Everything's gone. But we have highly detailed digital scans of this thing. And we can easily build this in a virtual reality environment, which it already has been done numerous times, because one of the first organizations that I read about that did highly detailed laser scans of the outside of the building, at least, was for a video game, right? So at least in video game land, which is not something sustainable because they could go out of business, it's been preserved. Now, if we use the spirit of the National Register criteria to instead not physically preserve buildings, not physically preserve things, but instead to digitally preserve them and actually use that money and that time that would be taken to preserve these things and the taxes that are paid on and all that stuff to build really great high quality virtual environments that anybody can go from any physical ability level, because disabled people can't get to some of these places, and make it open to more people. You'd be seeing it in a virtual way and not in a real way. And I understand that there's very, very different feelings and things when you go and you have the smells. Sometimes they're good and bad. Sometimes they're good. Sometimes they're bad. You have the smells. You can touch the rock. You can touch the facade. You can be there, and that's a very different thing than what it is virtually. But I don't know. Is it that bad? Do the criterion have to be honored in a physical way, or can we still follow the spirit of it in a digital way?
Well, quick question. Is the law written to preserve or to conserve? I know a lot of people use those terms interchangeably, but
Right.
They are very, very different.
I think the sense is conservation.
Well, no, okay. You asked a couple of questions there, and the answers are yes and no.
Right.
So yes to what? No to what?
Yes. So, are you legally under the National Historic Preservation Act? Do you have to preserve eligible properties? And the answer is no. You can mitigate in other ways. And in that response, your digital recording could constitute appropriate mitigation levels.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the same thing? No.
Right.
Is it a great thing? No, or at least not yet. Because like you were talking about, the phenomenological, I always have trouble saying that. It's good to be on a podcast when you can't pronounce words. That element is is really important. And like Notre Dame is a great example, because half the people who, were like outpouring, like the concern about, Notre Dame burning,
Mm-hmm.
they're not Catholic. Like it's not there as a religious setting. It's there as part of the public setting, right? Like that's the geography and the feeling of the city. That's the backdrop. And it is a place that tourists go to. So it has a public aspect that way as well, that if you travel there, you're probably going to visit it, right? Like, and so like tons of people have photos of them standing in front of it or inside it or, whatever. And that is lost in the digital preservation.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, someday in the future, it'll be all holodeck and you'll end up there and then Moriarty will try to kill us all. But generally, it's like right now, the technology is not there to simulate the most important aspect of this, which is part of the interaction of the city.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's, in my mind, and I'm sure plenty of preservationists will disagree, but in my mind, the most important aspect of cultural resources is not the stuff, but it's how we interact with it, particularly for built resources like buildings and structures and stuff like that. And so for the Reno of the future, but by all means, build new buildings. Maybe preserve a subset for adaptive reuse or something like that. But maybe with those new buildings, you maintain something that ties back to the look and feel that people hold in their heads as historical Reno. So maybe you start incorporating mid-century elements into your newer buildings, right?
Let's circle back to what people's concept of historical is here in a second, but back to Notre Dame for a second. As far as not being able to get the look and feel of the city and its setting within the city, that's a really weird thing to say too, to me, because the cathedral's 800 years old. So it's surrounded by a real mix of past, present, and coming up to future, right? Like there's modern buildings. If you look at it from a certain angle, you can see modern skyscrapers in the distance. You can see the Eiffel Tower. You can see other older buildings around it. There's probably nothing that's 800 years around it, or 800 years old, that's right in its own block, except maybe buildings associated with Notre Dame. But it's just this mix of time, right? This mix of time that's around it. So what even is the character and feel of Paris, to be honest? What is it? There is new stuff being built. It does change. So how can you preserve that? What are you preserving?
Well, hey guys, like I'm gonna be really pernickety right here, but like there's you got like nope, very pernickety. I know.
Doug could literally see like 10 castles out his window right now.
it's like two.
He's in one.
It's two. It's just
he's
two.
Actually in
It's
two.
just two. Yeah. It's just two.
It's just two, guys. It's only two. I have to go to like other sides of the house to see them. Yeah, but like, so people use the term preservation, conservation interchangeably, but they're hugely different concepts. So like when we say preserve, that actually means nothing changes whatsoever. And then when you say conserve, that means you basically say you're going to manage resources. And so most heritage laws in most countries are about conservation, which people will make that difference and sort of confuse the two and assume that when we're talking about conservation, they're like, oh, preservation, you will repeat it exactly 100% as it was when, I don't know, it got designated, or there's a big thing where they'll turn back a place to like a certain period or something. And that's a big thing in like the UK is some properties, they'll have like 500 years of history or something. And they'll be like, yes, we're only going to show as it was in like 1806 or something like that. And that's closer to preservation. But in a sense, conservation doesn't mean you can't change a building or the look of the building. It means you have to think really hard about what changes you're making and why you're making those changes and why that building is important. Now, is that building important because a specific event happened at it. Like, so in Dallas, the book repository, that's pretty close to preservation. There's like that room, all those books have basically been in there since, was it 62, 63? When did they assassinate Kennedy? Somewhere in the, wherever that date was in November or something. Basically, they've kept that building exactly the same as it was, almost in preservation. But a lot of other places, is it because it has this particular type of architecture? Is it the windows that make it so important? If it's just the windows, you keep the windows and, add modern aspects to a building. So, it depends where you are. But if we're talking conservation, it means a lot of stuff can change pretty drastically to be able to do it. And there's a term which I am now completely blanking on, but it's a big criticism, is basically what they'll do is in the UK, they essentially hollow out buildings. So they'll keep the entire facade, just the outer wall, like, if it's a brick wall, and they literally gut. So you can look at these like in drone footage, and there's nothing on the inside of these buildings. And they've managed to quote unquote conserve it and keep it in the historical feeling by keeping the outside. But essentially all you've done is, it's almost like actually Notre Dame, where you've basically burned down everything in the inside, and then you keep the outside so it looks the same, but it's not anywhere all the same. So there's a big criticism of that as well. So you can keep something looking like it, but is it really?
In the US, the law is called the National Historic Preservation Act. So I think that covers, are we talking about preservation or conservation? There is a conservation aspect in that preservation is not always possible. And then we can, mitigate. But preservation is the first step. And particularly for built resources, it tends to be the most important step. And like that's the benchmark. If it's eligible, if it's actually listed on the National Register, preservation is the default. But then if you can't do that, you can mitigate in other ways. Although a lot of times you lose the eligibility status in doing so.
Yeah, and I'd like to bring up just one quick point here, because it's based on what I was talking about with the mid-century modern folks here in Reno, and then also what Doug was just talking about with, what are you looking at with a certain thing? Like you said, is it the windows? Is it the blah, blah, blah? What's making this thing? But, we like to pass the buck as humans in general when we don't take responsibility for things. And a lot of times we'll say, oh, well, we're keeping that building around because it's a blah, 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 blah. It's a example of this. It's something happened here. But in reality, it's people that make the rules, right? It's not the architecture. It's the people that make the rules. So if someone thinks that this thing should be saved and preserved, and they get enough other people that think the same thing, well, then it just will be, right? So if we all think, hey, this has to be preserved, and I think in some cases that shifts from a few people to historians to society based on the age and significance of the thing. Like Notre Dame Cathedral is now a societal thing. Like the entire world pretty much thinks this thing needs to be preserved and rebuilt, right? Like everybody thinks, with few exceptions, that we should rebuild that and bring it back up to its, whatever it was before the fire, and probably way newer. I mean, I don't know how they're going to make it preserve the look and feel with brand new wood inside, unless you're going to reclaim everything or make it look distressed. But anyway, the point is that's become a more of a cultural, societal thing. But like the mid-century modern movement in Reno, that is literally being run and spearheaded by people who were kids when those buildings went up. Right? That's their look and feel of Reno. That's not the look and feel of Reno. That's their concept of the look and feel of Reno. If in the 50s they had asked their parents, hey, we need to preserve some stuff, what would you preserve? Well, they would preserve the stuff before all the mid-century modern crap came through. That's probably what they would have said. This mid-century modern movement has ruined everything in Reno. We need to go back to dusty old, building facades and bricks. I mean, it's all about perception. And at some point, when it moves beyond the people who are alive right now who remembered these things, now it's historians that are, and that's an even smaller group. It's historians that are trying to promote this. And then once it moves beyond the realm of historians and textbooks, it goes into culture and society. And if it makes it to that point, well, it's going to be real hard to get rid of. But I don't know, Stephen.
I feel like this kind of falls into like the notions of like historic archaeology, where we're giving the voice to the voiceless, right? Like that there are plenty of disadvantaged populations and underrepresented who aren't the ones in power right now, and if you don't take everything into account, they basically their heritage can be eradicated under the steamroller of popular heritage, or just flat out development, or whatever. So in the cases of this, that the way that the law is structured, it doesn't give preferential treatment to the mid-century modern stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you have stodgy old historians and archaeologists and architectural historians and whatnot, talking about things that really aren't that popular.
Yeah.
We're there, and it's like, oh no, this is really important, and it's like, but that's the point, is that the notions of who these things are important to, like it's a diverse community, and as such, you're going to end up with a diverse sampling of representative history.
Yeah, and here in Reno, it's coming down to numbers, to be honest. It's a little about money, because Reno's such a small town that if you have a voice and you're not afraid to use it, then you'll be heard by the city council and you'll be heard by the mayor. And there's really just one company that's coming in. It's Jacobs Entertainment. And they're the ones that want to put up a bunch of new casinos. They've got this whole district planned for downtown Reno where there's a bunch of mid-century modern hotels. And to be honest, they're winning, because they're just knocking stuff down. I mean, they already own the properties and they're evicting people and knocking it down. And the preservationists are trying to get them to either revitalize current structures, which just don't fit with their business model, but they want them to change their business model to make that fit and bring it in. But honestly, all the development companies need to do to win in almost every single case is wait them out. It might be 20 more years, but they really just have to wait out the people that care about this stuff, because a lot of people these days really just simply don't, like the younger crowd, they just don't care about the preservation of these old buildings in general. Whereas the people who, do care about them, are dying off, to put it bluntly.
Well, and that's where the preservation laws come in, though.
Well, yeah,
right? Like that's the whole point of having cultural resource laws.
You're right. Is to preserve that stuff.
Is to
I'm not quite sure though that necessarily, having gone through a lot of these things in different countries, I think people's reasoning is a lot more complex than they want to preserve the buildings. A lot of time it is actually preservation, conservation comes in not because they particularly care that the building is there or old or looks a certain way. They care about new development, because essentially you will get people who come in and basically gut neighborhoods and kick everyone who's there is out. So preservation and conservation becomes one tool for people to be, usually in most cases, the little guy, as a chance to fight back against development that usually is not going to benefit them. Everyone will come in and will say, oh, it'll make these number of jobs and blah, blah, blah. But really, it mainly goes to the people doing the development. A lot of people, gentrification, get kicked out or whatever. They don't really benefit. The jobs that come in tend to be service jobs, so you don't get as much money. It goes on. But I'd say that sometimes a lot of these things, you could actually have this fighting for generations. I'm not sure if you could wait them out, because it'll be the same issues. And preservation, conservation is just one manifestation of those societal problems. I'm not sure they'd go away in 20 years. I think you pretty much could fight them out for generations if you wanted to. I think it more has to do with actually you just have the money. and you buy everyone out and kick them out, and there's not a lot of laws to protect people, and they just wait until eventually someone forecloses or dies off and then buys them out. So, I mean, in a sense, you could sort of wait for them to die out, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure waiting for a certain generation who has a connection to mid-century or whatever is necessarily the main reason of why people fight. I could be wrong. I mean, people could really love their mid-century. Did you say hotels or houses? Or?
Yeah, they're hotels. They're hotels. They're hotels in this case. All right, Doug, I'm going to cut you off right there. This is a good place to stop, and we'll pick this up on the other side. There is some comments about that to be made as well. So we'll be back in just a second. You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
Well, we got a minute. I'm going to buy that truck I've been wanting.
Wait, don't you need like weeks to shop for a car?
I don't. Carvana makes it super convenient to find exactly what I want.
Hold up. You're buying a car on your phone? Isn't that more of a laptop thing?
You can shop wherever you want.
I like to do my research, read reviews, compare models. Plus, Carvana has thousands of options. How'd you decide on that truck?
Because I like it.
Oh, that is a great reason.
Go to Carvana.com to sell your car the convenient way.
All right, we're back with CRM Mark Podcast, episode 165, and Steven has got some comments to Doug. Was that a woo for 165?
Yeah, why not?
Nice.
Yeah, well, and this is kind of something he's talking about, how a lot of times the push behind historic preservation and historical issues and cultural issues tends to be kind of a sort of NIMBYism. And I've been thinking about this a little bit lately, how in some ways you can get like disingenuous, historical pushes, because that's the way that people can put their foot down. Like, and you know, like we're against this project, but the only legal avenue you have is through historic preservation.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, sometimes there is a historical element to it, but a lot of times it, you know, that's almost the, you know, back burner of, you know, issues. It's like, yeah, okay, it's historic. And, but, you know, more than that is the lack of other avenues to participate in like review of projects, right? Because they're private projects, and how else do you get a say?
Well, and that goes in Reno. That goes to what Doug was saying too about you know, basically kicking people out and buying up the properties, because that is one of the big things, and that is one of the big reasons why some people, not everybody, but some people are pushing for the preservation of the mid-century modern hotels, is because the people currently living in them are low-income populations, and there's no other low-income housing being created for them to move into. So you're literally putting people on the street, and Reno already has a pretty severe homeless problem, but you're putting people on the street and really kind of making the problem worse for a little while. And I think others that are pushing for development are just kind of hoping they'll go away and the city will take care of it as they develop. And that's what's being done. You know, they've already torn down a number of these hotels. There's over 60 in Reno. They've already torn down a number of them. And those people are either on the streets living with other family, or in a lot of cases, they're living there because they don't have other family. And they're just in sorry situations now. And I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah. And this also comes sort of like the dark side about preservation and conservation is the ability to use this as an outlet to fight development means you have to have resources. And so essentially the only neighborhoods that really get designated, or buildings, you know, historic landmarks and whatnot, tend to be in well-off neighborhoods. I mean, there's a pretty long history in the United States, but, you know, other countries as well, of basically whenever you need to build a highway, you put a highway through the black neighborhoods. And none of those buildings were ever considered worthy of historical preservation. And it's probably the same here. I imagine they're probably going to knock down most of those hotels, unless there's one that happens to be in a weller off part of Reno, because those are the people that have the time and the effort to fight and get these designations. But a lot of what we do on historical preservation and conservation is very one-sided in a very narrow point of view of either experts or people who can use it as a way to keep their neighborhood from having a highway put through it or whatever else development's going. So, I think it's a good idea. And it is what Stephen was talking about, how this is the only method for communities to be able to have a discussion with new development about what direction their community should go in and what it should look like and what should happen in it. And unfortunately, it's actually a very narrow view of what you can comment on, which is you can either let someone else come in and do whatever they want, or you can keep it exactly the same. And that's not really good managed change. But I think that's a whole bigger issue about how countries and politicians and communities need to deal with how you do manage change, instead of the sort of ad hoc of, oh, well, someone wants to build a massive hotel here. They're bringing in money. Let them do it, regardless of the local impact on people.
Yeah, well, right. Thinking that making it a requirement to also provide new low-income housing would be a great mitigation for tearing down these hotels. But that's more based on current use, and I'm not aware of any legal framework where you can really push that.
Right.
I mean, unless you get like city council on board or something like that, right?
Yeah, local ordinances do that a lot. So it depends on the city. And again, unfortunately, a lot of those ordinances tend to go the other way. So instead of mandating affordable housing, they'll mandate things like, oh, you have to have this much distance between houses, and essentially keep it low density housing and not very affordable. So that tends to be it. But there's a lot of local ordinances. And I know I should probably remember the name of this, but there's a good book about how there's a real difference in the Eastern United States versus the Western United States. And that's how development happened a lot later in the Western United States when cars had been invented, and actually how a lot of the car companies got local ordinances to essentially, like, the reason we have suburbs is because there's actually ordinances saying you can't have high density housing, which is cheaper and more affordable than, like, McMansions and all sorts of stuff like that. So yeah, there's a lot of conflicts. And in theory, yeah, you could just say any new development has over X number of acres has to have a percentage for low income housing. And I know there are laws in certain cities and in certain countries that have that as well. But it doesn't, in practice versus theory, doesn't always work out that way either.
Yeah. And Reno's got the other complex problem of not only geography, but economics as well, because there's a lot of the current administration and the current mayor, she just got reelected. She's been pushing real hard for the last 5 years now for bringing in a lot of tech companies from the Bay Area. And that is happening. Tesla's here, and there's a number of other companies that are here, and she's helped bring all those in, her and the city council. And the good thing is, I guess it's bringing these other markets into Reno, and it's helping build Reno up, but the downside for everybody else is housing prices are going through the roof across the board, like all housing, new housing down to the 40 plus year old townhouse my wife and I just bought. I mean, everything is going through the roof, and they're tearing down all the low income housing in downtown Reno in favor of newer modern structures to keep attracting these people in. And it's pricing out the lower income levels. It's pricing all that out. So yeah. Anyway, in the last part of this segment and the last part of this podcast, I do want to bring it back to CRM archaeology and CRM archaeologists, because I I used to collect a lot of stuff, do different things, and I've totally gone backwards on that. And I don't know if it's because we moved into smaller places intentionally and gotten rid of things. I mean, I just got rid of a bunch of more books just the other day. Archaeology books. This is the first time I've done that. I got rid of actual archaeology books, and they're just books I've collected across the country. Like, I didn't really need my Ohio Mound Builders book anymore. I bought that when I worked in Ohio. I don't need it on my shelf. I mean, it looks cool. Great. I read it. Fantastic. But I don't need to brag about that to people. I'm literally not referring to it. And I'd rather somebody else got to enjoy that. So that's kind of an aside. But the point is, I'm more in favor of these days of preservation through publication, preservation through digital representation, and preservation through these other means rather than just actual, preserving of the physical things in the physical places. And I think it's up to us as CRM archaeologists to figure out exactly how and what that means, because we're the ones that are boots on the ground for this. And I am talking about your 2-flake lithic scatters and your small can scatters. How can we describe these things and record these things with technology that may or may not exist right now, but how can we think about technology that could exist that would help us preserve the things that are traditionally difficult to preserve? How can I preserve what it feels like to sit in the Great Basin in the middle of nowhere with no cars, no airplanes overhead, no anything, and sit on a Native American site with Native American artifacts all around me, maybe petroglyphs on the walls? How can I preserve that? That's what I want us to think about as professionals. How can we preserve what that feels like?
Well, you can't.
Yes.
Yeah. You like, also, first of all, it's not preservation, because I really hate the term like preservation through recording or, anything like that. 'Cause it's not, it's transferring, you're doing a change. At best, you might call it conservation through recording.
Sure.
But you're not preserving it exactly in that way. And I honestly hate those things where they're like, oh, we should capture at this very moment, because landscapes are constantly changing. Like, even if you were to go back 4,000 years, 6,000 years, the climate was still changing. You still had the late Holocene, quite a bit of changes. You still are getting forests changing and all that stuff. And so you're actually getting desertification of that area at that time. So, if you go back 8,000 years, Reno looks very different than it did 4,000 years ago versus 2,000 years ago, just on the climate alone. And people are, constantly changing the environments and what they do and how they adapt. And I don't think it's our job, or maybe it's a fool's errand, I guess I'd call it, to try to preserve every single moment as it is, because you can't. I think what we should be thinking about is, I know this is going to sound really odd coming from archaeologists, but maybe we shouldn't be thinking too much about the past, but maybe thinking more about the future and how we want our future look, whether that includes lithic scatters or roads or skyscrapers.
You're exactly right, Doug. You can't preserve everything exactly 100%. And even if you could, what exactly are you preserving? Because like you said, 8,000 years ago, Reno was underwater. It was under a lake. So, what are you preserving when you say, let's preserve it right now here at this slice and point in time? But I think we can get close.
Clearly, the preservationists just need to flood Reno. Let's forget
actually
this whole
the answer.
Mid-century thing. Dam up a creek. Let's just bring in some water, flood it out.
I'm all for mid-millennia, not mid-century. So,
and so our podcast ends with Chris's proposal to obliterate a city. I think that's a good place to stop, guys.
I think that might be a good place to stop.
Mass destructions.
All we got to do is drain Lake Tahoe into the Reno Basin and we'll be done. So, that's pretty much it.
Oh, easy.
Which happens almost every May anyway. All right. Well, I think you're right. That probably is a good place to stop. Let's end it right there. I'm really interested in other people's thoughts on where preservation will be going. I don't think it's very sustainable to just keep recording stuff the way we have been and then writing reports and putting these things on site records and dropping them in file cabinets. Let's think about the future, like Doug said, but what's the future mean to you and what's the future mean to different cultures and groups, and what does preservation and conservation mean in the future? You know, what does this look like? We're looking at file cabinets with stuff from 20 years ago in it right now. In 20 years, what are we going to be looking back at for what we recorded today? You know, what does that look like? So anyway, we'll end it right there. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.arcpodnet.com/CRMArcPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at arcpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. Thanks, everyone. Fucker. I fucked up. I started over again. Maybe we'll just leave it like that. See you in the field. Goodbye.
Bye.
Oh, Jesus. This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.